Hi everyone. Welcome to our powdery mildew update with Dr. Michelle Moyer. But before I get into that, I just got a few announcements. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sue, President of the BC Growers Association. We had our business risk management tool workshop, which was very well attended. 75 of you came out for that, so thank you. And there were endless questions, so we think you all received it pretty well. The PowerPoint presentations from that workshop are available on the cold damage resources page of our website. So if you want to have a look at them, they're up for you to find. The insurance programs, for those of you who weren't there, are a source of financial support that the provincial government offers to growers. It is important to the economic sustainability of our industry that growers and wineries are registered in the programs in order to maximize the support available to you through the extreme weather events we've been experiencing. If you're not registered for agri-stability, you are missing out on an important cash flow to help you through the next couple of years. We know from our survey that only 35% of growers in BC were covered by agri-stability. So it's one of our goals at the BCGA this year to try and up that number significantly. The deadline for 2024 is that you register by April the 30th. And so please get hold of them as soon as possible if you're not registered. We're also collaboratively organizing some workshops to introduce you to other sources of loans, Ag Credit Corp and Farm Credit Canada. If you're not familiar with these programs and the loan programs that they offer, attend the lunch hour info sessions on April the 25th and May the 2nd. And you can find more details for that on our website at grapegrowers.bc.ca. There is also one more, if you missed it, on agri-stability and production insurance being planned together with Sustainable Wine Growing BC later in the spring, and we'll send you an update to your inbox. Just to some housekeeping for today. We've muted everyone for the presentation, and we'll open the floor to questions at the end, as Dr. Moyer has found that the answers usually surface throughout the presentation. If this isn't the case, please feel free to type your question into the chat box, which will be being monitored throughout the talk. And now to our event. We are very fortunate, lucky, I don't know, have enough words to welcome Dr. Michelle Moyer with us today. She's a well-known as a long-time professor and viticulture extension specialist at Washington State University. I'm sure many of you have heard her speak before. And I think I can speak on behalf of all the BC wine grape industry to say that we're envious of the extension centers down in the US and the universities that put them together, and are so grateful that people like professors like Dr. Moyer are prepared to extend their extension to us here in BC. The majority of Michelle's position at WSU focuses on extension. She excels at working with researchers to identify relevant research topics and boiling down the information into workshops and presentations using a language that growers understand and including practical advice to apply in the vineyards. Her personal research has focused on criteria for defining grape quality and ideal growing conditions, developing site selection models, understanding how canopy management strategies influence grapevine growth, and optimizing the timing and farming techniques to control disease pressure and increase grape quality. Last year, as you all know, we had a very heavy powdery mildew season, and we are grateful to have North America's foremost expert here on powdery mildew to share her knowledge with us from her research and just her general vast knowledge on this topic. So enough from me, and over to Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. I think you might have oversold me a little bit there. So
no, I don't think so.
A lot of pressure to go forward. So I do thank you guys for the invitation to speak via Zoom, and I do apologize that I was not able to make it up for an in-person meeting. Similar to you guys, our growing seasons run right parallel with each other, so it can be hard in the spring to leave the state. Because we're setting up research trials and preparing, doing our own checklist right now for powdery mildew management in some of our research. So over the course of today's talk, I have about 40 slides or so. And for folks who know me, know I'm very verbose. So that'll probably take me like 45 minutes to an hour to present. But the intent of today's talk is to provide that 30,000 foot view. Sorry, I can't convert that into meters for you, but I think we can all appreciate that very high up view of what it means to think about a preseason planning session. And of course, many of you probably have already ordered products for your disease management this growing season, or you've already reviewed your programs from last year, but this will hopefully serve as a refresher to make sure that you did everything leading up to that point, or for folks who are just now starting to think about disease management, because we all had some other things that happened this winter that was probably first and foremost on our brains of what to maybe do in the next couple of weeks as we prepare for the growing season. So first and foremost, and Sue knows this because she sat through some of my training programs, I'm a big advocate of planning. So I'm a planner. I'm a person who makes a checklist just so I can check things off of a checklist. And what I find is really helpful about this heavy pre-planning process is it can really take a lot of anxiety out of disease management when we're actually on the ground running in the growing season. And so really, I think that some of the epicenter of a really good disease management program is having that planned out now. And so when things are moving rapidly in the actual season itself, we have something we can ping and control our anxieties with disease control against, right? So, and it's also really easy to pivot it within a plan if you have a plan in place, right? If you already know A, B, C, D, and you get to D and you realize, ooh, maybe I need to change something, it's easy to say, okay, I'm going to go to E rather than F. But if you don't have any plan in place, you can quickly find yourself in a spiral of just trying to play catch up. And as we know with disease management, it's very, very hard to have a good crop if you're always playing catch up, but it's much easier to have a good crop if we are being preventative. All right, so we're going to go through 4 major steps for preseason planning for powdery mildew, but this also really applies to any type of pest management program, whether it's weeds, insects, botrytis bunch rot, et cetera. These basic steps are the same, but we're just using powdery mildew as a case study. So the first step in designing any pest management program is to really make sure you understand the biology of the particular pest, because that is the entire intent behind disease or pest management, is to disrupt that life cycle of that particular, whether it's a fungus or an insect, is to disrupt that life cycle. But in order to disrupt the life cycle, you need to know what that life cycle is. So when we think about grape powdery mildew, the first thing we want to think about, or in actually any system, is how does the vine development or vine growth, how does that influence the potential disease or pest that you might be targeting? And specifically, when we think about grape powdery mildew and Vitis vinifera, or the European wine grape, one of the key factors for having really good disease control, particularly on the fruit, is understanding that there are very key windows during the grape growing season when clusters will be infected by powdery mildew. And we call this the critical window. And what that's referring to is that when tissue is quite young, it is highly susceptible to mildew infection, but as tissue ages, it becomes resistant to powdery mildew infection. We call that ontogenic resistance or age-related resistance. And so as clusters start to emerge, they are a young tissue that's highly susceptible, but they're very small, right? They're not a very big target, and it's very early in the season. So while they're highly susceptible, the typical risk for infection pretty early in the season is a little bit lower. But as we start to go through rachis elongation into the bloom period, suddenly those clusters or inflorescences are expanding, becoming bigger targets. Weather conditions are usually starting to get much better for mildew, for disease development. And if we think about it, fungal spores are pretty similar to pollen. And what are flowers designed to do? Capture pollen. We all know grapes are self-fertile and not really capturing pollen, if you will, but their structure and design is to do that. So the risk for infection is quite high during the bloom period, but also the susceptibility of the plant is still very high. So this is a key time window for disease management. When berries start to age, and this is usually about a 1 month post 100% bloom, what you'll read in the literature will say 3 weeks after fruit set, But trying to define fruit set can be quite difficult for a lot of folks, where we all tend to know what 100% bloom looks like. So we'll say 4 weeks after 100% bloom, or 3 weeks after fruit set, because fruit set usually takes about a week or so. The berries themselves will actually become resistant to mildew infection. So if mildew shows up in the vineyard at that time, you will no longer get infection on the berries. The rachis of the cluster can still be infected with mildew, but in general, the berries themselves won't. And by the time you get into the veraison and near harvest, if tissue was not infected at that point, it won't be infected at that point. So from a mildew management perspective, by focusing on that bloom time period, you will achieve about 80% of your entire season-long disease control on fruit by focusing and having really good management during that window. Interestingly, the same thing applies to foliage. So young tissue is highly susceptible to powdery mildew, but as leaves age, they become resistant to infection. But unfortunately, as we all know with grapevines, they have indeterminate growth. So there's always new tissue that's developing over the course of the growing season that will be susceptible to powdery mildew infection. Or if you're growing particular varieties that send a lot of summer laterals, or if you're hedging a lot in your vineyard to control canopy growth and then getting summer laterals, you'll have a lot of young tissue popping all over the canopy. But as leaves age, they will become resistant to mildew. So if you are able to keep a leaf disease-free, once that ontogenic resistance sets in, again, you won't have additional mildew developing on the canopy. But if a leaf does become infected with mildew when it's at a susceptible stage, it will never develop that full ontogenic resistance as it starts to age, right? So it's very important, especially around this bloom time period, to keep leaves clean and healthy, so that way you can capitalize on ontogenic resistance as the end of the season goes. For folks in Eastern BC, very similar to Eastern Washington, we're quite lucky in that we can actually control a little bit how much new healthy tissue is out there towards the middle of the season through the use of irrigation management. Whereas for folks who are growing in the Vancouver area, or in our case, Western Washington, when something is rain fed and you can't really control that water, then we do have to deal more with later season canopy management for mildew than folks in drier climates have to. The other interesting thing with powdery mildew is that idea of transitioning from being, when fruit transitions from being susceptible to resistant, it's not obviously a hard and fast transition, right? It's biology, there's a gradient by which things happen. And if powdery mildew infects a cluster right as it's starting to transition through that ontogenic resistance period, what we can end up is with additional risk for botrytis later in the growing season, and I'll tell you why. So when powdery mildew infects as a cluster or individual berry, or the fruit, all the berries in that cluster are starting to transition to being resistant, what ends up happening is the powdery mildew fungal spore will land on the berry surface. It'll send out a germ tube and an apersarm. These are just structures that the powdery mildew is trying to use to infect the grape skin. And what happens is the plant is transitioning to being resistant, it fights back, right? And it does programmed cell death, and the plant will kill the individual cell that the powdery mildew is trying to infect. Well, powdery mildew is an obligate biotroph, so it has to feed on living host tissue. So then the mildew responds by quickly trying to grow and set up another feeding site, and the plant fights back. And you'll see that if you take a microscope and zoom in, as these little tiny trails of dead cells following a fungal hyphal growth. So you see probably light, thin strands here on the screen and little dead brown spots underneath. And that's the plant versus the pathogen trying to outgrow each other. Eventually the powdery mildew will peter out, or the plant will, like that's where the transition, timing relative to transition occurs. But now we have a bunch of little tiny dead cells all over the grape berry surface, which could be problematic when those berries start to swell towards the second phase of development, or are little sites for botrytis bunch rot, or the botrytis cinerea fungus to infect towards harvest and then get exacerbated bunch rot. So I don't know if you guys have experienced that in the past, but typically if we have a really rough or a hard powdery mildew season towards the end of bloom, we tend to have a little more botrytis at the end of the growing season as well. And it's often related to this, what we call diffuse infections or transition period infections of powdery mildew on aging berries. So it's a dirty secret. So by controlling powdery mildew really well during bloom, you actually give yourself a heads up for controlling botrytis bunch rot towards the end of the growing season. I mentioned a couple times some weather conditions related to powdery mildew development. So again, reviewing the pathogen biology, or reviewing the biology of disease here, is powdery mildew is a Goldilocks disease. It tends to like fairly moderate growing conditions. It doesn't like really hot weather. It doesn't like really cold weather. It usually likes things right around 25 degrees Celsius. And so, of course, we all know, especially for those of us in the inland part of the PNW, we have really big diurnal temperature shifts where it can be perfect temperature during the day. But if it gets really cold at night, especially in the spring, that actually helps us with disease management. It keeps disease development very slow. But conversely, in the late summer, when we have fairly decent nighttime temperatures, when daytime temperatures creep, starting to get above 35 degrees Celsius, that can actually also damage mildew. So in general, the inland PNW, from a weather perspective, is usually pretty easy from a mildew management relative to places like Napa Valley or upstate New York. The challenge for us is what typically catches us off guard is when we have a relatively mild June and July, when we don't have heat spikes. And while I know the heat dome event, I believe, of 2021 was pretty hard on all of us, I'm guessing a lot of you guys had very little grape disease in your vineyards. And I'll show a couple, I don't know if I have the pictures in this particular slide deck, but even in my own disease trial blocks, we had our heat dome event middle of June, right at the end of bloom. And in my unsprayed vines, I had these are vines that have no mildew treatment all season long, and my vineyard is dirty as heck. It is so dirty. We had no disease on the clusters that year. And the very next year, my untreated check was totally unharvestable because we had nice mild conditions at the end of bloom period. So weather can really, really drive during that critical window, really drive the severity for disease. And that's usually when we have this year was hard for mildew versus a previous year was not. Think about what those weather conditions were relative to average during that kind of bloom to end of bloom period. Powdery mildew also does not like UV light. It's really hard to separate temperature from UV simply because when the sun's out, it's also warming up the leaf surface temperature. But UV exposure, UVA and UVB, particularly UVB, can really damage powdery mildew. So oftentimes you'll see preferential buildup of mildew inside the canopy first before you get it on the outside. We do see a lot of mildew on the outside of our canopies, even here in Eastern Washington. Part of that is infection usually happening early in the growing season. So mildew's there. So you're actually probably seeing dead mildew at that point. But in general, good light exposure and warm conditions help reduce disease pressure. Mildew also can dry out, desiccate quite rapidly because it's mostly on the surface of the plant. So it likes relative humidity to be moderate to high, usually above 40%. So when we have daytime conditions mid to late summer that are below that 40% relative humidity, that's quite helpful for us for desiccating mildew. The other thing too is mildew, very similar to how grapevines produce a crop over a 2-year period. Mildew itself is almost a 2-year type disease cycle. So what happened, so if you had a really bad mildew year last year, that likely means you have a lot of overwintering chasmothecia that formed that are going to serve as a lot of potential primary inoculum going into this growing season. Now that could mean that if you didn't do any treatment relative to a season, so 2023 versus going into 2024, or a 2022 going into 2023, if you had unsprayed vines, you might have more disease going in this year than you did last year. But in a typical management situation, we don't really think about that overwintering inoculum because most of your disease control happens in the growing season. A lot of those overwintering chasmothecia are degraded due to environmental conditions, don't actually end up on the vine, release their spores too early, release their spores super late. There's a lot of things that have to align to get all of that inoculum onto your vine. But it is something to think about. If you've had a really tough year last year, you may want to adjust your spray programs for this year to maybe start a little bit earlier or include more contact products like sulfur, potassium bicarbonate, or oil, just to kind of catch up with that potential risk of slightly higher disease pressure as the season starts. Oh, yeah, good. I do have my slide, so I can't see my little slide set here. So this is just an example of what weather can happen in the growing season. And again, these are pictures of my untreated vines. So this is my research block. Sue's been there. She knows it's absolutely disgusting and super dirty towards the end of the season. It's where we do all of our fungicide trials. So I have a lot of untreated checks in this particular block. And this was really unfortunate for my graduate students who are trying to do some disease work when you have no disease in a particular year. But in 2021, this is what our unsprayed vines look like at the end of the growing season. And in 2022, which was a cooler vintage for us here in Eastern Washington, this is what those same unsprayed vines look like at the end of the growing season. And so this is with no fungicide intervention. This is just Mother Nature's fungicide intervention of temperatures at just the right time during that critical window. So I can't overemphasize that enough. So that's why it's so important to have really good spray programs in a cool, wet year during that critical window, but also where you can potentially play if it's a very hot season during that time period. So just wanted to leave that picture there to burn into your retinas, because I know for me, this was, again, a very powerful tool to visualize the criticalness of weather during that critical window for powdery mildew infection. The other thing we can do, since weather is so important for disease management, one of the things that we can manipulate, that we have a little control over, is what we do to the grapevine. And I think historically, or I shouldn't say historically, in modern viticulture, we've really relied on really good chemistries to carry us with disease management, almost to the point where we've kind of forgotten how to do some cultural practices like canopy management, shoot thinning, leaf removal, because our chemistries have been so good. They absorb, they spread, they have really long efficacy windows. So, and honestly, in general agriculture, we perhaps have gotten a little lazy and have over-relied on really good chemistries. And that it's nice to have things that can do work for us, but it's also important for us to every once in a while to step back and say, okay, what are some of the basics though? Let's go back to those basics so to make sure we don't forget how to do them. And fortunately, for those of us that are in areas where we can control irrigation, canopy management through irrigation, through good irrigation and nutrition management, can really help you with your disease management programs. And this is true for both powdery mildew and botrytis sponge rot. By keeping canopy growth under a reasonable level, keeping canopies open, you really are allowing Mother Nature to help you reduce that environmental favorability for disease development. Some of that could also be in the form of cover crop management. So cover crops are a great thing in vineyards. They serve a lot of different functions. But if you're in a particular site where you are having to actively add additional water to the system to keep your cover crop alive, that might be exacerbating some of your disease challenges as that cover crop transpires and increases relative humidity and reduces air temperature in your particular vineyard. So something to think about. In addition, I really hope by the end of this talk, if you're not actively doing canopy management strategies like shoot thinning or fruit zone leaf removal, whether it's mechanically or by hand, that you maybe consider that as an adoption, as a fundamental component for your disease management program. So we often think of it as a viticultural or a horticultural management tool, but it is a plant pathology or disease management tool as well. So as you design your spray programs, you should be writing in when you're doing key canopy management activities as well, because those will help you not only reduce that environmental favorability for disease, but it's also going to help you improve spray penetration for when you do choose to use a chemical intervention. All right, so we talked about reviewing the biology. Hopefully we are able to think of, okay, for powdery mildew specifically, we're focusing, while we may be managing for canopy disease over a longer period of the season, for mildew, we really want to make sure we're covering that critical window, which is probably, if we want to define it for easier purposes, around rachis elongation to 1 month after 100% bloom. Weather conditions drive that. So if it's cool and wet, we need to be much more vigilant for mildew management. If it's hot and dry, perhaps we can play a little bit more, and that we really need to make sure we're starting to rethink the role of canopy management and cultural practices for disease control, and have them not be solely just supplemental tools, but dominant tools that we then supplement with chemical control. So step 2 is review the best practices for designing that chemical component of a disease management program, and some of the cultural practices as well. So I'm going to highlight here on this first slide is best practices for canopy management. Sometimes when we do nothing to the canopy, that's okay. Maybe you have a contract that wants a really big Sauvignon Blanc canopy because they're trying to get some grassy flavors. So these are the things we're trying to deal with or balance from a horticultural perspective, but that does also potentially mean you're going to have more challenges with disease. So we do have to keep in mind that everything we do in the vineyard has our intended consequence and probably then has an unintended consequence. So it's good just to identify those as we go through. But really, shoot thinning and fruit zone leaf removal, I think, are 2 very key things for mildew management. Shoot thinning at the very basic. And then after you guys have had a cold season, I will say you will probably have a lot of latent buds push this year, especially for those of you that are spur pruning. I know many cane prune, but if you are spur pruning, you will have a lot of latent buds push. So you're probably going to have overly dense canopies as a lot of shoots push that you may not have anticipated. So just something to think about for going into this management season is, because you've had cold damage and a lot of additional buds will be breaking as the vine goes through the recovery process, you may have overly dense canopies that you weren't anticipating, which could exacerbate additional disease for this year. So just something to keep in mind. So shoot thinning, absolute must. for vineyards, especially if you're spur pruning. Fruit zone leaf removal is quite helpful. I'm a big advocate of pre-bloom fruit zone leaf removal. I do feel in the inland P&W, we often have pretty good growing conditions where we don't see a lot of reduction in things like fruit set or some of those negative attributes that are associated with really early fruit zone leaf removal, but it can happen, right? So something to be conscious of. If you remove a lot of leaves, right, when the clusters are undergoing full bloom, you can get a reduction in fruit set. If you have really tight clusters, though, maybe that's something you want, right, to loosen up that cluster architecture. But sometimes can be hard to control. I recommend here in Eastern Washington, if people are going to do fruit zone leaf removal by hand, we actually do it pre-bloom because that allows the fruit zone to open up, sprays can get in there, and then we start to get a shading effect again on that fruit zone as we start to get into the heat of the summer multiple weeks later. Orgo nuts, this is not recommended. This is just for me to show a similar vine or similar set of vines at various stages of what canopy management might look like at a pre-bloom period. So the more you open up that canopy, the more likely sunlight can get in, things dry off faster, and spray can get to where it needs to go. The other thing I really recommend people doing, and we all kind of fall into this category of we learn what we need to know for right now because it's all we have time to do, and then we'll catch up with things later. But I really want to emphasize that you should take a time to read every single label of every product that you plan to spray in your vineyard. It can be very time consuming, but there's a lot of good information on those labels and probably a lot of information you wouldn't have expected to be on those labels, such as compatibility with other products, timing in which they work, perhaps even things such as, hey, if you use it at this time, this product may actually act as a plant growth regulator, et cetera. So please read your labels. And in some cases, I understand that you may not get the label in your hand until you actually purchase the product, but there are databases out there that'll allow you to preview labels before you go out and purchase the product. Of course, you're legally bound to follow the directions that is on the label printed on the product you purchased, but previewing some of these labels in a database will at least give you a chance to take a look at something that maybe you've never used before, or to kind of refresh your memory before you purchase a new product. So there's a lot of great resources out there. And I don't know if British Columbia has your own database online to do this type of label searches, but we have several here in Washington, and of course some commercial sources that I do know cover the US and Canada that you can look up and pull down labels. So highly recommend, as you start to build your spray programs in the winter, even if you don't have the product on hand, pull down one of these labels. They're most likely going to match the one that's going to be on your particular product container, but familiarize yourself with that label, and then you can know exactly where to look for certain key information once you get the product from your supplier. If you've never read a pesticide label before, it can be daunting. And I know if you have read one before, you can tune out for the next couple of minutes here. But I just wanted to walk people through what key information to look for on a pesticide label. So most of us will recognize where a product name is, but underneath that product name is where the active ingredients are. And that's pretty important to know what specifically is in the product, because we all know there's some pretty fantastic names out there for various fungicides and insecticides, but they may not be very descriptive of what's actually in that product. The other really important thing that's often on the label, just on the front cover, is at the top or in the middle, there'll be a little section that says FRAC, IRAC, or HRAC, which is Fungicide Resistance Action Committee, Insecticide Resistance Action Committee, or Herbicide Resistance Action Committee. And those are international organizations that take the information such as the active ingredient in the product and define whether that particular product is at low, medium, or high risk for resistance development, right, in whatever pathogens that product is targeting. And there's a lot of things to understand about how a fungicide is labeled, whether it's a systemic or not, the active ingredient, blah, blah, blah. The FRAC groups simplify that. So if you see the same FRAC number on two labels, you can essentially assume that they behave very similarly, where they may have different active ingredients, but those two active ingredients are going to be in the same class of fungicide. So it's a very helpful tool. Labels also tell you a lot of precautions, obviously provide very important information on PPE and reentry intervals and things that are very important for you and your vineyard crews to adhere to when using those products. And they'll have general use statements. You'll find information on whether they're compatible with certain adjuvants or foliar fertilizers or other fungicides or insecticides. That's really great information on storage and disposal. But the more important thing is I'll have a whole list of very crop specific recommendations. And you'll notice between crops, there's going to be different tools or different ways to use this, this particular product. So it's very, very important to read your grape specific disease recommendations or insecticide application recommendations from those crop specific descriptions. You'll learn little things such as you can't spray this product more than twice, or you have to wait, this product is good every 7 or 14 or 21 days, or this product is best used at veraison, or et cetera. There's a lot of really key information that's crop specific on the label. So again, you start by reading the front page. Product name is okay, but we're more interested in active ingredient and the Resistance Action Committee code. Obviously, all the stuff on safety is super, super important. And then you jump to the crop specific items. For folks that are interested or concerned about potential pesticide resistance or fungicide resistance, specifically for FRAC, they have developed a nice little app that you can download on an Apple or Android device. It does not provide any type of crop recommendations or information, but what it does do is it allows you to look up that active ingredient on your label, and it provides a description of whether that active ingredient is a low, medium, or high risk for fungicide resistance. And that's important when we start talking about key practices to avoid resistance development in your vineyard. And the reason why resistance development is important to consider is if you spray a product and your particular target organism, botrytis or powdery mildew, is resistant to that fungicide, you spent money spraying a product and that product won't work, and then you'll have disease control failure. So you'll have good, not only have you spent money and time trying to control disease, it just won't work, right? And so that's a situation we don't want to be in. And so FRAC has developed some tools to help us with monitoring those processes and developing better designed programs to prevent that from happening. The other thing to think about when we're reviewing best practices is to consider when you need to start your spray program. And I think historically with grapes, we often started on a calendar basis, right? So first, at least I know here in Washington, there was always, well, I start spraying on the 1st of May, and that's always worked for me. And I spray every so many days afterwards. And that probably did work out when vine development was quite consistent, but I don't know about you, but it feels like in the last 20 years or so, the thing we know about what an average date for bud break is that an average is an average of all the extremes and is not really representative of what things might be from one year to another. So setting a calendar date on when you start your spray program may not get you to where you need to go. And so I really recommend starting on phenology or vine development stage. And we'll talk about very specific phenological stages later. But really what that means is adjusting to the plant. And as we know with grapevines and grapevine powdery mildew doesn't matter if the plant is not actively growing. So there's no point in spraying when things are super dormant or if the vine's not developing well. It's the intent is to start a spray program when it matters most, right? And in the US, we typically say if you had a really bad year last year, we start the spray program at 3 to 6 inch shoot growth. If we've had a very mild year, or if you're pretty confident in your design program or program design, we start spraying between 6 and 10 inch shoot growth. So we wait a week or two later. And at that point, then we go on a calendar-based spray simply because of intervals on labels. Efficacy periods are based on a calendar or described as a calendar, 7 days, 14 days on the label. The thing, though, that we use to adjust our spray programs is since that critical window, which is bloom, which is a phenological stage, is so important. When we design our programs, we actually design them around bloom and then build them out from there. And in some cases, we may say, oh, I want to start my first sulfur spray of the season at 10 inch shoot growth. And I'm just going to keep spraying sulfur until I hit phenological stage of rachis elongation, right? And so maybe that means in some really fast years, that's one spray, and in a very slow, like cooler spring where the development may be stretched, that might be 4 sulfur sprays. But as long as the good things that you're targeting around the bloom period, then we do a phenologically adjusted spray program, but our actual applications happen on a calendar type interval. The other thing to remember is, and this might be true if you guys had a rough year last year, is maybe relook at what your spray intervals were. Short intervals are usually between 5 and 7 days, and these are typically recommended during periods of really rapid shoot growth. I don't know if this was the same in British Columbia, but last year we went from bud break to bloom in 28 days, which is ridiculously fast. And in a lot of cases, going back here, That's where people lost disease control, because they normally build a program to have 3 or 4 sulfur sprays before they get in to their actual pre-bloom spray. And really, if you measured, if you didn't start spraying until 10-inch shoot growth, you got 1 sulfur spray, and then you were already spraying your pre-bloom spray, right? And if they didn't adjust that program to spray their pre-bloom spray at actual pre-bloom, they were spraying sulfur well into the start of the critical window and didn't quite line up where their products needed to be relative to vine development. So during periods of really rapid shoot growth, we do recommend shorter intervals, simply because you have to keep up with how fast the plant is growing. We also recommend shorter intervals during periods of high environmental influence. So if it's cool and humid and rainy, or cool, humid, and cloudy, that can exacerbate disease. So spray more frequently. And when you are using contact products, and this includes a lot of organic programs, if you're using a lot of products that are not absorbed by the plant, you do have to spray them more frequently because they degrade on the surface of the plant. Longer intervals, or between 10 and 21 days, are during periods when the vines are not growing so rapidly. They're during periods of low disease pressure, so when it's really, really hot or cold, or really cold, or when it's dry and sunny. And it's for products that are absorbed, so they're protected from environmental conditions. You'll likely notice on every label, there's a range, 7 to 14 days, 14 to 21 days. And that tells you if you're spraying that product and it's really high environmental risk, spray every 7 days. If you're spraying that product and it's really hot and dry and it's towards the middle to the end of the growing season, you can go to the 14 days. That's how you can interpret that interval that it's on your label. I did mention fungicide resistance, and fundamentally the way you avoid fungicide resistance developing across the entire population of powdery mildew or botrytis in your particular vineyard is to make sure that you're constantly rotating between fungicides. If you spray the same fungicide over and over and over again, and it's a high risk fungicide, what will end up happening is that at some point a random individual, because it is random, right? Random genetic individual in that population will be naturally resistant to that fungicide. And then if you spray that population, all of its buddies die, it survives, it then clonally reproduces, and all of its offspring are now genetically resistant to that particular fungicide. You spray the vineyard again, and anything that might have escaped last time, it's now dead, and these progeny and their subsequent generations take over the profile of the vineyard. And then you get disease control failure because all of the mildew in the vineyard is resistant to that particular product. But if you rotate through, if a naturally resistant individual makes it through the first spray, it likely will not have resistance to a different fungicide group. It's actually there's a physical or fitness, what we call fitness cost, associated often with having fungicide resistance. And very rarely do you have individuals with multiple resistance to multiple fungicides. I will say very rarely, but that doesn't mean it's not the case. We actually do know in the Pacific Northwest that a lot of our powdery mildew is resistant to both FRAC 11 and FRAC 3 fungicides. And then in botrytis, there's many individuals that are resistant to 3 or more FRAC groups. So this repeated use of these products have built some resistance up in the population. We can still use those products. We just have to use them smart in a better way throughout the growing season. But fungicide resistance management is best done first through rotating products. And so that's what this slide is essentially explaining, is that please make sure when you're designing your spray program that you are rotating between FRAC codes. The other thing to think about is you want to make sure you have enough tools in your toolbox so that you can rotate. So what if it happens to be a really cool wet year and you may need to spray one more time? You need to make sure you have enough tools to do that. And really what we recommend is to have at least half of the number of high risk, or half the number of FRAC groups relative to your total number of sprays. So for example, if you're going to spray 8 times, you need to have at least 4 different products. And that doesn't include things like sulfur or oil bicarbonate, things that are what we consider very, very low risk. Those you can use all you want. That they have some other challenges if you overuse them, but from a resistance management perspective, those are not a problem. But what it does mean is if you want to spray 8 times, you can't just have sulfur, a FRAC 11, and a FRAC 3 in your toolkit. You really won't be able to develop a really solid program unless you're doing sulfur, FRAC 3, FRAC 11, sulfur, FRAC 3, FRAC 11, which doesn't really allow you to line up good fungicides with key time periods, right? It can be problematic. So just something to keep in mind. You'll want to have choices, and more importantly, you'll want to make sure you have some multi-site products in your toolkit to kind of throw in there every once in a while to help level the playing field of the pathogens. And so that's where I mentioned this concept of multi-sites. So these include some of the biologicals fall into this multi-site category, things like sulfur, things like potassium bicarbonate, things like oxidate. So all these kind of things that work on the surface of the plant, and they have very, very low resistance risk, which is nice. So you can either use them as a part of a rotation, or you can tank mix some of your higher risk fungicides. So if you do want to use a FRAC 11 fungicide for both powdery and botrytis control, but you know you're concerned your powdery mildew might be resistant, adding some sulfur into that will help clean up those potentially problematic populations. The challenge with multi-sites, though, as we talked about, is those are those products that you tend to need to spray more frequently. And it's really more important to use lower rates at higher frequency than really high rates at low frequency. So for example, with sulfur, and I again apologize for using American units or non-metric units here, is it's much better for you to spray 2 pounds an acre of sulfur every 7 days than it is to spray 10 pounds per acre every 14 days. Right. So you'll get much better control at frequent low dose applications than you will at just dumping things on the vineyard and letting things happen for the next 2 weeks. Another tip too, though, as we start to integrate more multi-sites into our spray programs and biologicals into our spray programs for resistance management, or just a general transition away from synthetic chemistries, is they can be a little bit hard on our sprayer nozzles. So as you start to integrate these products, you will have to be much more cognizant of sprayer calibration and swapping out your nozzles every year if you have a machine that uses exchangeable nozzles. So you do have to be careful with those there. There's some other things you'll have to incorporate into your program as we start to make a transition to more multi-sites or some of these biological chemistries. Not a bad thing, it's just something to be conscious of. All right, step 3. This is where we bust out your last year's program. So we know a little bit more about biology. We know a little bit more about some of the best practices like fungicide rotation and focusing on key windows for timing. And so now let's look at those spray programs we did last year and see, did we do that type of stuff? And so we're going to play a little game on Zoom here, which is a little hard to do. So it'll be a self game that I will give you the answers to as we go through, but there will be a little bit of downtime here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys 3 different spray programs, one from Washington, one from Oregon, and one from California. And in all cases, these are I would love to say they're 100% commercial spray programs, and these were all programs that were submitted to me. And then of course I tweaked them a little bit for a teachable moment, but they're spray programs I'm going to have you guys review. I'm going to show you spray deposition cards so we can see what spray coverage is. And then we're going to talk about why every single one of those programs resulted in total crop loss at the end of the season to powdery mildew. So you're going to see commercial programs that were slightly modified, but not, like I said, not ridiculously modified, only slightly modified. And they all resulted in crop loss. So we're going to try to play the game to see if we can identify what went wrong in the program, because I'm guessing that's all for folks who had a challenge last year. That's probably what you'll be doing this spring as you look through your spray program. All right, game time. So this is from Salem, Oregon. It's Pinot Noir, of course, because that's what they grow down in Salem, Oregon. And this particular program is total crop loss. When you look at these tape or spray regimes, you're going to see the dates that things were sprayed. You'll see the product that was sprayed. The pink lines indicate key phenological stages of vine development, so you can kind of situate yourself as to where critical windows might be. I've listed the FRAC code. And again, remember we talked about FRAC codes. You want to alternate them, so you're not spraying a whole lot of the same FRAC code, especially if it's a single number repeatedly. You'll see the rate. You can ignore that. These were, I'll tell you right now, every program used appropriate product rates. So that's not something to worry about. And then the water volume that was used. In this particular vineyard, they had a very warm, dry season, and rains started in September. So in general, it's a fairly low pressure disease year, but they had crop loss, and they use an over-the-row multi-head sprayer. I'm going to quickly flip to the next screen so you can see what that spray coverage is, and I'm going to go back to this and give you about 45 seconds to a minute to kind of quickly just review and see if anything stands out to you. Okay, so this is what the spray coverage looks like. When you see the tractor, this is the alleyway. This is the canopy. So this is the vine on the one side of the canopy, what the spray cards look like in the middle of the canopy and on the outside of the canopy. And this is an over the row, right? So this is the other side of the canopy with the outside of the canopy and closer to that fruit zone interior of the canopy. So you can see what the spray coverage looks like. And this is what's considered good spray coverage here on the left-hand side of the screen. We're going to go back to that program and I'll give you a little bit of time. We don't have a timer or anything, but I'll give you about like 15, 20 seconds now. I'll look through, look at the products, ponder. I'll let Sue give me the thumbs up when she's ready for me to move on. Sue, you have a lot of power. Ready? Probably not. None of us are ever ready for this, but it's also very awkward to sit in complete silence on Zoom. So we'll move forward because you'll get the answers here too. So, and we can discuss later if you want to, but this is what we've noticed. So first, the spray coverage looked really good. So we'll give it that. So when I got this program and they supplied spray coverage cards, like, okay, that, I don't think it's a problem with the sprayer. Because I will tell you about 90% of the time, loss of disease control is due to the sprayer and not the program or timing. So that's always where we check first is sprayer coverage. I'm a little nervous about fungicide resistance. And the reason why I'm a little bit nervous about that, or what triggers a potential fungicide resistance in my brain, is that in general, this was a pretty solid program on the surface, but it was a low pressure disease year. So and it was good spray coverage. So they really shouldn't have had disease. And what I'm nervous about is they spray Frac 11. So Frac 11 is a highly product that we have resistance to. And even though it was often tank mixed, they sprayed it back to back. So here, right around the bloom period. So Quadris Top has 11 and a 3. And then on the June 20th spray, they used Flint and Vanguard. Well, Vanguard has powdery mildew suppression in it, which means when mixed with other products, it does a decent job with mildew. But that other product was a Frac 11 product. So I'm guessing they probably have Frac 11 fungicide resistance in this vineyard. And then essentially it was as if they were spraying almost nothing during this bloom time period. And then they sprayed another Frac 11 late in the season. Even though they tank mixed it, they still used it again as a primary driver. So I'm a little nervous about this. So for this particular program, we recommend, also they had a couple spaces where they stretched some intervals. So in this case, this is an 18-day window. When they had Frac 3 and sulfur to Quadris Top, that's a little bit long. And in this case, they had a 21-day interval right after a potential problematic spray, right? So there's a little bit of stretched intervals there. So I'd probably have this person re-review how frequently they're spraying and maybe test their vineyard for Frac 11 fungicide resistance the following growing season to see if maybe they need to pull those Frac 11 fungicides from the program and try something else for a little bit. All right. Our next one is Patterson, Washington. So this is right down the alley for me. It's a Sauvignon Blanc block, same thing. Pink indicates when we spray or when key phenological stages are. You'll notice here as well that Washington State tends to stop spraying much sooner than Oregon, simply because we get quite hot at the end of seasons. That's normal. So just for folks that might be concerned about that, that's pretty normal for us. But again, they had total crop loss. It was a cooler and wetter season through early July. And they also had a multi-row sprayer. We're going to quickly look at the spray coverage and come back to the program here. This is what their spray coverage looked like. So it's the same setup as before. The inside of the canopy is right here. The outside on both rows is right here. So, and this is what good spray coverage looks like. This is what low spray coverage and what complete runoff, which is also not good, right? Looks like, so low and complete coverage and what good is. So I just want you to take that in. And we'll go back and we'll spend a few seconds or so kind of reviewing this particular program. And then Sue, if you could do a head shake again, that'd be helpful. Thank you. All right. Thank you, Sue. Through that, couple of things. So I'm guessing we could all agree that that spray coverage was not good. Really heavy spray on the outer part of the canopy, almost nothing making it into the area that we care about, right? Right into the fruit zone. So they need to check their sprayer. They need to recalibrate or do something. I'm not nervous about fungicide resistance because the rotations were pretty good. While there are, so in this case, there's Frac 3 sprayed back to back relatively early season, but they really mixed a lot of stuff in this June 13th spray. So I really wouldn't be worried that a Frac 3 resistant population would have made it through. I thought they used a lot of multi-sites, especially oil and then oxidate later season. But really what I want them to focus on is these intervals early season using contact products were a little stretched. Things like oil, 10 to 20 day intervals can be problematic for that. They don't really last that long in the vineyard. And but primarily they need to go back and fix that sprayer. The sprayer is the major problem here. All All right, so we're gonna go to the last one. So this is Napa, and we all like to make fun of Napa, even up here in Washington, so we can laugh at them because they've had total crop loss too in this particular scenario. They had a cooler and wet season with a heat spike in August, so they pretty cool. And then Mother Nature kicked in, and they also had an over-the-row sprayer. You can see their key phenological stages here. We're going to look at the spray coverage and then come back for a little bit. This is their spray coverage. And so again, look at everything here. And this is what is considered good. This a lot of yellow indicates not a lot of spray happening, and a lot of blue indicates runoff. And runoff is also a lot of drift because the product drips off the leaves and land. It doesn't stay on the plant, it goes onto the ground. So we'll just kind of chew on that a little bit. We'll go back to the spray program. So Sue, you know the drill. Let me know when you're ready. Okay, Sue's ready to move on. All right, so what did I think? One, it's too much spray. They're like, whatever they're doing, they're way over spraying relative to the size of that canopy. And that probably means the product is not staying on, and means that then essentially they're spraying fungicide rates that are below the actual label rate because a lot of it's ending up on the ground, right? So that is a problem. So recalibration of another situation where recalibration of the sprayer is good. And it's interesting because relative to the Washington one where they weren't getting enough spray, here you're getting too much, but the end game is still the same, not enough product staying where it needs to stay. So overspraying can be just as problematic as underspraying. I would potentially want them to check fungicide resistance. It was a high pressure disease year, and they really sprayed a FRAC 11 product right around bloom. Granted, it was the only FRAC 11 product, but we know that there's a lot of FRAC 11 fungicide resistance up and down the West Coast. And so that might be something we want them to double check, that this key bloom period spray in general. Otherwise, look, the rotation looks pretty decent, but yet this program failed. So that would suggest to me that there might be some fungicide resistance to FRAC 11 products. And I would want them to go out and recalibrate that sprayer as well. So it may be heavy on the sprayer side, but the fact that in general, this is a pretty good program, but they had crop loss, I'd want to check some of these FRAC 11 fungicides that were sprayed during the high risk period. All right, so that was it. That was the game. So it's more fun when we do it in person, but hopefully we'll maybe share the slide deck and you can have access to those and play the game with your vineyard crews if you'd like. So step 4 is going back to what we saw in 2 of those 3 scenarios, is how important your sprayer and spray practices are for disease management, because you can design the perfect program that has the perfect times, but if your sprayer is not actually doing what you think it's doing, none of that matters. And that's very, very frustrating to have the conceptual things all down perfect and then have the actual application part fail on you. So how we spray or how we maintain sprayers is super important. There's a lot of things that can go wrong with a sprayer that I think we take for granted. First and foremost, I'm always quite shocked, especially with larger operations, when I deal with the people who are writing the spray recommendations for that vineyard, don't even know the sprayer that's being used to spray on that vineyard. And there's a big difference with how certain products and, while you have products that are ideal for certain diseases in vineyards, there are products that work better with certain types of sprayers. So for example, if you're using an ultra low volume water sprayer, you may want to use more systemic products because you're just not going to get enough water to do complete coverage, right? So you need products that move a little bit. If you are using a product that has exchangeable nozzles and you use a lot of contact products, you want to make sure you're constantly swapping out those exchangeable nozzles because they can be corroded by some of those contacts. So there is a lot of, while we talk about variety and site selection, there's a lot of pest management, sprayer and product selection, actual physical sprayer and product selection that goes together as well. And so there's a lot of things that can go wrong with your sprayer. And so we want to make sure all those things have been cleared. The deck has been cleared for those by the time we start the spray program. First and foremost, we've talked a little bit about nozzles. So nozzles influence drift potential. So we want to make sure we're being conscious that we're not drifting product everywhere, both from a let's save money perspective, right? If we want to spray something, we want it to stay where it needs to go. But we also don't want it to hit off target organisms in the potential vineyard area, or honestly impact our vineyard workers or neighbors, right? So drift is really important, and nozzles can influence that. What the nozzle is made out of influences how long those nozzles last. Plastic nozzles tend to degrade pretty quickly. Ceramic nozzles do pretty well. So just something to think about. You want to buy high quality nozzles. It's very easy to try to save money on spray nozzles, gets, $1 versus $5. But in the grand scheme of things, paying for a really good nozzle is worth it, right? Because if that nozzle doesn't work, then everything else doesn't matter, right? And really your nozzle type influences the type of coverage you have. So whether you have good coverage and good penetration and good splattering, of course, across the foliage versus stuff that bounces or leaves you giant gaps in your spray regime. The challenge here is I can't cover everything you need to know about sprayers in this very short presentation. This I think would be a great presentation to bring somebody in for another webinar. There's some really good work done both in Canada and the US on sprayer calibration and all that jazz and all the things that go into that. So I really just wanted to, for this one to point in that, hey, sprayers are super important. So make sure you take a chance to familiarize yourself with that sprayer. I think in vineyards too, one of the biggest things I've seen in the last 20 years or so, or it's probably starting in the last 40 years, but then really kind of becoming important in the last 20 as we start to think about things like water conservation, is how much water is used to spray a vineyard. And of course, I think most of us will not use 100 gallons of water early season and 100 gallons of water late season. We understand that early season we have less foliage, we use a little bit less water in our sprayer. And then as this canopy develops, we perhaps use a little bit more. That's just using the water volume to adjust. And what water volume is for is it just a carrier to help spread a pesticide over a vineyard, right? It's very easy to pour a cup of water into a saucer and have it cover the saucer, but to pour a cup of water into a kiddie swimming pool, you don't get good coverage, right? So you want to up the water to get good coverage, right? So water is just a carrying tool for us. But over the years, what's considered high volume and low volume has changed culturally and conceptually. And so we used to spray 300 gallons an acre because that's what the tree fruit did. So let's just apply it to grapes. And we used tree fruit sprayers. We're going to spray like tree fruit. And when we went from 300 gallons an acre down to 100 gallons an acre, that was a big to-do, right? Oh my gosh, you're not going to have enough water. But we realized, we do have enough water when we spray 100 gallons. And then when people started going from 100 gallons down to 50 gallons an acre, that was a big to-do. Going, you're never going to get enough coverage. But we realized, hey, early season, even 50 gallons is too much. And then we started going 50 to 30 gallons. So let's start at 30 gallons an acre per season in the season and maybe go to 50 and then 75 as the season progresses. But now we have ultra low volume water or sprayers that maybe can only spray 10 gallons an acre or maybe go up to maximum of 30 gallons per acre. And while these still have really large tanks designed to help you spray more acres, because filling a tank takes the most time in the spray process. So it reduces total spray time by allowing you to spray a lot because you're not spraying very much per acre. The challenge is how do you get really good pesticide coverage if you have a very large canopy and you're spraying a very little bit of water, right? And if we start to use more biologicals and softer chemistries, that's going to be a harder and harder thing to wrestle with, getting good spray coverage on ultra low volume sprayers unless we really adjust our canopy manipulations to match that potential low water volume. So just something to think about. If you've recently bought a new sprayer and you're not so happy with your disease management, maybe check to see what that water volume is, or think a little more deeply about what that water volume delivery is, or the maximum delivery that you can do with that particular sprayer, and ask yourself, are you applying enough water in that sprayer, or is perhaps you maybe need to swap out and get a different sprayer because your vineyard is maybe not best suited for that particular sprayer type. So just something to keep in mind. When to spray is super important. As we all know, we never want to spray when it's really high wind because you can see that spray go somewhere else. But it's also important not to spray when it's extremely still outside. So while high winds has short distance drift, we may not view it as short distance because it's blowing a couple rows over. But with really calm, just like with inversions, right? It's an inversion situation. When you have no wind, small particles can actually drift up and then do we're talking kilometer level distance travel. So it's important to spray when you have very light to moderate winds. But I will know, we see this a lot in the US. We have rules, or we have best practices of I'm sorry, it's in miles per hour, but don't spray above 6 when winds are 6 to 10 miles an hour. Well, what ends up happening is people then start to stretch that a little bit, and their personal cutoff will be 12 miles an hour. Well, the 6 to 10 is high winds, right? The cutoff should be about 5-mile-an-hour winds. And this can be problematic, especially in the inland PNW in the spring, where we usually get blown out of vineyards before we get rained out of vineyards. So this is something to keep in mind, that you may have to adopt some anti-drift techniques, or really think about whether or not you have enough sprayers to quickly get a spray done when you know it's a wind-free or a low wind period, right? So that's one of the things we grapple with in Washington. Is many vineyards just don't have enough sprayers to get through the acreage in an appropriate amount of time, especially when we get blown out in the early part of the growing season. The other thing to think about is it's best to spray when temperatures are cool outside, and that's usually earlier in the morning, and when relative humidity is a little bit higher. When relative humidity is low, water droplets will actually desiccate faster as they're traveling to the plant. And if you have really tiny water droplets, because perhaps you are using an electrostatic sprayer, or perhaps to get more gallons per acre on your low water volume sprayer, you really up the pressure, so it pushes out more, and the droplets are not really, really small. Those droplets could potentially evaporate before they hit the target if you are spraying during periods of low relative humidity and high temperature. So you do want to make sure you're spraying at a time that's optimized relative to the droplet size that your sprayer can produce. So just thinking about that. If you are in a dry climate and you have the ability to use exchangeable nozzles, one thing we've started to recommend down here in Washington is to use air induction nozzles. So these are nozzles that produce very large droplets, but they're hollow. So they don't bounce when they hit the plant, they shatter. But because they're slightly larger, they don't evaporate as quickly, and they can actually get to the plant or where they need to go in periods of low relative humidity or slightly warmer temperatures. So just something to think about if you have that type of sprayer. One of the books I just love, and it's from your brethren in Eastern Canada, is the Air Blast 101 Spray Guide. It's a fantastic book on all things sprayers. It says Air Blast. A lot of us think about the rear orchard blast sprayers, but essentially any type of sprayer, you can get some valuable information out of this book. Here's the QR code if you'd like to scan it, download it. It really is just absolutely fantastic. So I do recommend that's a good winter read or spring read if you have a little bit of time. But your season start sprayer checklist is you should replace or repair all the nozzles on your sprayer regardless of type. Check all of your pressure gauges. Pressure is how we regulate water water in the particular sprayer. And if your pressure gauge is off, you may actually be at too low or too high of a pressure where you're not getting the right droplet size in the gallons per minute, and thus gallons per acre, or essentially liters per minute or liters per hectare that you want out of your sprayer. Make sure all your tanks and lines are clean. That's just a given to prevent some product incompatibility. And then calibrate your sprayer. And that's making sure the nozzles are oriented towards the canopy, not directly into the canopy, but maybe slightly towards the back. They're actually hitting the zones of the canopy that you want. Whether or not you're going to use air, if you have a sprayer that is air assisted and has the option of turning the air on and off, and then what your ground speed is. It's good to check that every year, because little things such as tire slippage or over or under filling your tires, and sometimes with gear changes, you may not always be traveling the speed that you think you're traveling. So definitely double check your ground speed, because all of that then impacts your liters per hectare delivery and essentially how much product you're getting on your vineyard. So to help summarize as we close out here, when you're designing a spray program, it's always good to know the why and when of your sprays rather than what. So it's really important to develop a good timed program, and then you can backfill with what approaches, whether those whats are organic products, biodynamic products, conventional products, or essentially things like canopy management. The whats are the little tools. The why and the when help you more effectively target things. Review what you did last year, and we always say experience, it really is a great teacher. So if things didn't work out well last year, dissect it, use it. That's a data, scientists love this. That's a data point for you. So that's a data point of something that you don't want to have happen again. So review and see what might have gone wrong. If you've used the same program 2 years in a row, and 1 year it worked really, really well, and 1 year didn't work so well, compare those and maybe think about what the weather differences were between those 2 years, or what your phenological development stages were differing between the timing of those between those 2 years, and see was there maybe just a misalignment of timing, or was it just really conducive weather in 1 year and you probably should have sprayed more frequently. That can help you identify key gaps in your program. And really, you'll get the most out of your disease management program by getting the most out of your sprayer. So don't forget that as a part of the review process to make sure that your sprayer is properly calibrated and functional. A little plug, because I know we were talking before the meeting about replant programs. Often replant programs are an opportunity to try new things. And I know this is a hard thing because there's a lot of marketing and consumer perception involved. But I will say there's a lot of really good powdery mildew resistant grapevine varieties on the market now. And these are varieties that if you normally spray 10 times a year, you're going to spray once during bloom, or maybe twice. And maybe it's just sulfur, or maybe it's a biological. And so that is a pretty big shift in disease management, right? To get away with a single spray. And just think about telling your clients at a winery or a tasting room of, we only have to manage disease one time a season. Those folks in New York, they spray 15 times. That's a great marketing tool, right? And so just something to think about. There are disease resistant varieties that are commercially available in the United States, whether they're imported from France or being developed within breeding programs within the US. There's also some great varieties out of Italy as well, but these have really good enological properties and they are powdery mildew resistant. Now their cold hardiness, they're coming out of France or Italy, is yet to be determined. They're probably going to behave a lot like vinifera, right? So that risk is probably the same. But some of the stuff coming out of in the U.S. breeding programs, particularly Minnesota and New York, will also be selected for some cold hardiness, right? So that is a benefit for those of us in northern grape climates. I am super jazzed about this, particularly for vineyards that do our high bulk production blocks, like so maybe doing Chardonnay for bulk sparkling wine. Now imagine you can replace all that Chardonnay with something. I'm gonna use these the European varieties because they're named with Floreal, right? You spray it once, it goes into a bulk sparkling wine. It's labeled bubbles galore. Nobody knows what variety is in it. That's a fantastic low input on the vineyard side, high markup for you at the winery side. So just something to chew on a little bit as you face or walk into replant programs. Are there other types of tools you can adopt in these programs in addition to cold hardy varieties? Maybe it's cold hardiness plus disease resistance to really help you develop sustainable pest management programs. If you want to read a little bit more about powdery mildew management and fungicide resistance management, we've developed, I'm on a team that has developed some of these tools over the last couple of years. These are a couple QR codes to those particular articles. I'm going to leave this up because my next slide is just a thank you and questions. So we'll leave this up if folks want to scan with their phone. And at this point, I think we can take some questions from the audience, if there are any. You can type them in the chat, or I think that's what we wanted to do, correct? Type them in the chat, if able.
Right. Yeah, you can take them in the chat or put up your hand and we'll take your questions.
So James asked about tank mixing and why is there an update resource on tank mixing compatibility? So what tank mixing does is tank mixing allows you to mix two potential frac groups together. So if there's fungicide resistance to one, then perhaps the other product in that tank can take over and take care of those potentially resistant pathogens. So one might argue, then why not just use the one that like a multi-site like sulfur, right? So that's general question. And the reason why people still tank mix is one will use a multi-site with a much lower rate. So it'll be a particular product, a synthetic chemistry with sulfur at maybe 2 pounds per acre. So a typical lower rate than complete disease control. And the idea is not all the individuals in that population are likely to be resistant to that one. So this particular product will give you that 14-day interval that you're looking for and get the majority of the population. And then the tank mix partner is getting those potential resistant individuals, right? So that's what that's designed for. They also often function a little bit differently. And so maybe like things like sulfur, contact only, but can volatilize and maybe create a sulfur vapor around the plant to help with that. Whereas maybe this other product is only locally systemic, so it may not necessarily redistribute if there's a rain event or something, or it doesn't have a chance to absorb. And so the next question that you had is on tank mixing compatibility. So for folks who are not familiar with fungicide labels, they'll often say, do a test to make sure these products are compatible. Because if you mix the two things incorrectly together, you sometimes can get phytotoxicity and burn. The challenge is it's impossible for those of us on the ground to do all the potential tank mixing combinations that are out there when you start to factor in adjuvants and all these other things. So there isn't a modern tool available that says this product can mix with everything else. But most fungicide labels, most modern fungicides will have done some of that testing, or the companies will have done some of that testing prior to release, and they'll usually contain language such as is compatible with most other products. And for the most part, products are pretty compatible with each other. And if they are not, and that's well known, that is on the label. So for example, you will see on an oil label, to not mix with sulfur, right? Or you'll see on a particular, another label, do not mix with sulfur, do not mix with oil, or this product is incompatible with other emulsifiable concentrates. So they'll say that on the label. But unfortunately, we don't have a nice exhaustive list of all of the different product formulations and all the things that they're compatible with that might go in the tank. Because it's not just fungicide and fungicide, right? It's fungicide, it's adjuvant, it might be foliar nutrient feed that you're adding. There's a lot of different things. And it may be based that they're compatible, but if you're using really dirty water or really alkaline water, that compatibility fails. If the water is really acidic, so there's some water quality issues that can go with that as well. And then Claire asks best rate of sulfur. So Claire, the best rate of sulfur depends on what your goal is, right? So low rates of sulfur usually work really well with tank mixing. And again, it's all based on your frequency of spraying, right? So I've seen really good disease management programs at 4 pounds of sulfur per acre sprayed every 10 days. And I've seen really good ones at 2 pounds per acre sprayed every 7 days. And I've seen really bad programs with 10 pounds of sulfur, but they're sprayed every 14 days. So it's pairing that rate with timing. But if you are probably doing just a sulfur-based program, where that's the majority of your sprays, you're better off spraying between 3 and 6 pounds per acre every 7 to 10 days. So it's that middle rate at the low to moderate range. But again, a lot of that's weather condition dependent, and your sprayer type and your canopy development type. Good coverage is essential for sulfur.
I have a quick question about the mixing compatibility. Is there a good resource online that would have, that's fairly extensive as to what can be mixed?
No.
Okay.
No, and that is, a lot of us in extension have tried to do some of that, but there are so many other things that can influence phytotoxicity that it's impossible to try to keep up without getting sued by the company or a person who says, well, I saw online that this worked and then it didn't in my vineyard because they didn't clean their tank, right? And there was something else mixed in. So we do have to be, we don't usually follow through on that. But most compatibility things, if you do those little jar tests that they describe on the label, so we actually mix small components and shake, if they foam or produce heat, that'll tell you something's not good, right? That will burn your plant. And so those jar tests are quite good, and everybody can sacrifice a little bit of product to put into a mason jar and shake up to see if it produces excessive foaming or heat.
Shall I ask you, is adding sulfur to every spray as a sort of against resistance a good policy or not?
That's a tricky one, Sue, because the default answer would be yes, that's good policy. But then sulfur is not benign, right? You know, and I think that's where you grapple with: are you using sulfur for disease control? Are you using sulfur as a fungicide resistance management tool? And then what are the negative attributes that come with potentially overuse of sulfur? And that's going to be probably a company to company specific combination. But we'll say if sulfur is your primary disease control component, then yes, you should be using sulfur in every spray. That's the backbone. But as a resistance management tool, what you could look at it in essence and say, okay, resistance development happens based on selection, right? Spraying a product on existing mildew that's already there. If you're really good at keeping mildew very low and you don't have a lot of visible mildew in your vineyard towards the end of the season, you're probably doing a good job at preventing establishment from happening. So maybe you don't need as much sulfur. Sulfur is needed though, is if you're a person that you start to notice some colonies on your leaves and then you spray something, you are increasing selection pressure, right? Because there's already mildew out there that may be naturally resistant to something. So then perhaps if you're one of those people that sometimes you miss an interval a little bit here and there and you allow a little more canopy mildew to build up, then you probably want to consider adding sulfur into that routine mix. But we do have to be conscious of excessive elemental sulfur that remains on the fruit when it then goes into the winery can potentially cause some problems. And excessive elemental sulfur is a broad spectrum biocide, right? So it does, it's a problem for humans. It's an irritant. There's many people, so you have to be careful with if you or your workers are in the vineyard, anybody that might have a sulfur sensitivity, because that's not fun. One of my employees has a sulfur sensitivity, and so we have to work around when we're going in the vineyard, because it is not good for her afterwards. You can see the reaction that happens to that. And then, of course, with beneficial insects, which you may want to be cultivating for other biocontrol purposes, sulfur is a biocide, right? So that can be problematic for that. So you have to balance those. But in general, very low rates of sulfur can be helpful for the majority of your tank mixes if you need to do that. Now, if you are spraying other products that are low risk for resistance, say they're a plant inducer, so they have a P on them, or they're a biological, a BM, or they are not classified, those are not high resistance risks. So there's no need to do a tank mixing from a fungicide resistance management perspective. All right, Gary asked a fantastic questions of why producers don't list concentration. So Gary's asking this question, hey, when I pull up my label, it says 4 grams per acre. Well, what does that mean? Because the acre in the early season is this, and the acre at the end of the season in terms of canopy development is this. Gary, you bring up a great point. If you go to Europe, all the labels are listed in concentration, and they tell you to spray between 100 and 400 liters per acre, depending on how the season unfolds. I agree with you. But of course, the Canadian and US governments are not there yet in terms of label changes. So this is a policy thing. It is very, very difficult for companies to change labels. And part of that's driven by the fact that grapes are a tier 2 crop for most fungicide companies, meaning there's not enough acreage for them to really care a whole lot about us. What they care about are soybeans and alfalfa and corn, which are more, I guess corn's not really 2-dimensional, but in general, those are 2-dimensional crops. So grams per acre makes sense, right? Because it just stays that same acre is an acre is an acre, and they have a set delivery. But if you want to kind of recalibrate your brain, when we typically do fungicide trials, most of the time when we evaluate those at the university level, we are mixing that particular gram or ounce per acre in 100 gallons, right? So that's the concentration we're doing. And then we deliver it a varying gallons per acre difference. So we are using that rate per 100 gallon concentration, unless the label indicates otherwise. And then we change our delivery based off of 50 to 100 gallons. Many of us now, though, are actually adjusting that, where we're doing that concentration in 50, so that rate in a 50 gallons, and then adjusting between 50, so many gallons per acre if we max out at 50. The challenge is you can't do a concentration based off of 100 gallons and then spray 200 gallons an acre, because now you've doubled the rate per acre, which is now illegal, right? So you have to be a little bit careful with that. But you can think about it in that way. If you want to adjust things, you can potentially think about it in 100 gallons and adjust your gallons down from there based on canopy size. But I agree. I really, really, really wish the US and Canada would move to a concentration-based label and then adjust and give you ranges of water volume to deliver over the course of the season like they do in Europe. But again, if you back calculate the European stuff, it ends up being that it roughly translates to what the US rate is in 100 gallons. One day we'll get there.
Yeah. And then I heard a question somewhere else that, is there any winter temperature that's cold enough to kill the overwintering bodies?
Oh, for powdery mildew? Yes, but it will very much kill your vine. Grapevine powdery mildew casanthicia can survive up to -60 Celsius. So. Okay. Well, absolutely, you'll get rid of it, and you'll also get rid of the host too, which is another way to control mildew. But I think we'd rather keep the host and not the mildew. So no, that is the challenge with powdery mildew, is that those overwintering casanthicia are designed to overwinter. And you have to remember too, powdery mildew is native to Northeast North America, so it's evolved with very cold winter temperatures.
Right, so not relevant.
And so Mike's asking on my thoughts on dormant lime sulfur spray. So Mike, that goes back to, I think, one of my original comments on kind of a preseason spray. So dormant lime sulfur sprays are designed to potentially kill casmathecia that are overwintering in the bark, right? So those dormant structures. So in order for a dormant spray to really work, you have to saturate the bark with lime sulfur to get that product to where the casmathecia are, which are embedded underneath the bark. And that usually means about 300 gallons of product per acre to get enough spray that saturates bark. And the rates that we typically need of the actual product rate, not concentration or water volume, that we need of lime sulfur to kill powdery mildew is usually about 3 times the legal label rate to get efficacious control of powdery mildew. You'll get a little bit at the actual label rate, but you won't get complete kill. So when you combine essentially a low rate of the product with insufficient coverage to actually kill the entire population, you will reduce some of it, but really it doesn't help you if you have a normal spray program the next growing season. So your ability to manage the following growing season is based on your in-season spray program. The only time we actually really see a huge difference in disease levels is if you do a dormant spray and then do nothing else the rest of the growing season. You might see a little bit less mildew. It will still be unacceptable, but you'll see a little bit less mildew in some of the blocks that had a lime sulfur treatment than in the blocks that didn't. But that's only if you absolutely do not spray the next growing season and it's still at a level that's unacceptable, right? So the dormant sprays, if you are managing other diseases like phomopsis or any other type of trunk disease that you are spraying the dormant where that's the primary target, you might get a little bit of it. It's like that suppression label on, this is good for botrytis, but it suppresses mildew. Maybe view lime sulfur sprays or dormant sprays like that. They are good for something else and they might provide a little bit of suppression, but that should not be the primary target for your dormant spray.
So we've got a couple of minutes left. If anyone's got a burning question, stick it in the chat. And I'll just ask another one while we wait. So this year, a lot of us are probably going to be retraining our trunks, hopefully. Things are alive. Can you speak to protecting that new trunk?
Right, because that's always hard, right? You're not growing fruit, so why spray? Right? It's like the first couple of years of training your vineyard too. So I think that's one of the big challenges. We usually see a lot more mildew in a retraining situation and then in a new planting situation, right? And that's because there will be some resident Chasmathecia that are in whatever trunk stump that's left out there. And what you'll often see is when you're in the retraining process, you do have to be careful in that you are leaving enough shoots in that retraining process to balance the energy coming off of a full-size root system, right? So we often see that in retraining, in that people often will say, oh, it's a retraining period, I'm going to treat it just like I'm establishing a vineyard. Well, there is very different functional root sizes between a new planted vineyard and a retrained system. And in a retrained system, you have all those carbohydrate reserves and that full-size root system, plus that root system's capacity to access water and nutrients in the soil. So any shoots that you have left, they go, right? There's a lot of resources diverting to those. And when you have exceptionally rapid shoot growth, you have a lot of transpiration, you have a lot of young susceptible tissue, and mildew can take on a much faster, or start to build up quite rapidly. But really what I'd recommend is to keep on you don't necessarily need a synthetic spray program, simply because don't point in spraying really expensive stuff because you're not growing fruit, right? You are just focusing on retraining. And so maybe that's something to think about, using those kind of low rate, high frequency contact products in that retraining process, just to keep the canopies healthy. But you necessarily may not have to start a full spray regime because you're not targeting fruit, right? You can just kind of keep on maybe a 14-day schedule just to keep things at bay as you go. Because you're not, again, the main programs when we talk about their design is designed to target fruit infection, right? And keeping that fruit clean. And in this case, you're just trying to keep canopies healthy and growing. A little bit of mildew doesn't actually really damage the plant. It's when you have complete leaf coverage of mildew and your canes are turning gray from mildew infection, that's when you have a problem. But most of the time, a nice 14-day low rate sulfur program, or if you're really nervous, you want squeaky clean plants, a lot of this obviously will be based on your contracts and personal philosophy. You can have pretty good disease control with fairly low input during the retraining process. So protocols on once mildew is detected in the vineyard, kind of products that would happen. So if you are actually starting to see colonies in the vineyard, then simply it's a focus on why, maybe kind of reassess your sprayer calibration and frequency there. But if you start to see mildew, that's when you need to maybe think about some of those multi-site products, things like oil, sulfur, copper, or not copper, oil, sulfur, oxidate, things like that, some of the biologicals, because those are the ones that are more likely to have activity on kind of young or early developing colonies. The challenge is once you actually see a mildew colony, it's probably 2 to 3 weeks old. And so it's already sporulated a bunch, right? So you do have to be careful. The goal is obviously to not find mildew. The goal is to develop preventative spray programs where you don't see a lot of canopy mildew. So really, if you start to detect mildew, that means something failed several weeks ago in your spray program, and you just need to try to keep things hunkered down to keep that from exploding. But that does mean then, so look at your spray program. Maybe that means it's middle season, you have to spray a little bit, 1 or 2 more sprays than you normally would, simply because your canopies are infected, and so therefore they won't necessarily develop full ontogenic resistance. So that might be something to add. Or yeah, adding or doing additional tank mixes with some contact products when those colonies start to develop. But again, when you see mildew, that means it's usually a little bit older than when you first detect it visually. And so Mark's asking about UV treatments. So that's one thing we've been working on down here in Washington, also in Oregon and over in New York, is the use of UVC light. And so UVC light's a really nice, if you want to say contact style fungicide. It works well. You just have to use it frequently. And in some cases in Eastern Washington, we could probably get away with once a week treatments of UVC, but you have to have really good canopy management, because if the light can't get to in the middle of the canopy, the UV is not getting there, right? So so canopy management is extremely important with things like UV or UVC. And in higher or more conducive environments, twice a week is needed for it. So in many cases, what people are using it for is to kind of replace some of the early season sulfur sprays to maybe reduce some of that sulfur load, and then use a couple of synthetics during the key bloom period, and then switch back to UVC towards the remainder of the growing season when we're worried about heat or potential drift onto vineyard workers, or if vineyard workers are going in there, because there's no REI, no reentry interval when you use UVC. So yeah, it's available. It's just there's not many commercial companies that have produced it. There's I think David Gadori out of Cornell is going to have a nice custom build checklist for those that like to do fabrication on how to build your own, if you want to give it a go. But a lot of it's just, you have to make sure you are doing canopy management in your vineyard. If you're not, you're not going to get the disease control you're looking for.
All right.
I just wanted to point out that where is it here? Faraday pointed out, adding to that conversation about tank mixing, that there's changes coming, and she's put a link to the PRM.
Thank you. Site. Yeah, that's super important, because that's going to make your guys' life a lot harder in the coming seasons. We're not there yet in the States, but I think that's coming in. So yeah, what that is, a limitation on the number of products you can put in a tank, which, especially if people are using foliar, and that includes adjuvants, right? So if you start to use foliar fertilizers as well, it's either going to mean you're going to be on a sprayer much more frequently, or your ability to use things like tank mixing for fungicide resistance is going to get a lot harder. So you may have to rethink the design of your program, because you may not be able to do things like tank mixing, depending on the other stuff that you'd like to do at that time. So thank you. That's a very, very good share. And I do think everybody needs to read into that. I'm sorry, it's not on my radar because we're not there yet in the States. So, but that is something to heavily look into, because that will fundamentally change how you design things, for better or worse, or indifferently. It is.
All right. Well, if there's no other pressing question, just remains to me to say thanks to you, Michelle, for your generous time always, and the wealth of knowledge that you share with us. And we look forward to chatting to you again in the not too distant future.
Thank you, Sue. And thanks everybody for taking the afternoon.